All right, today we're going to be proving triangles congruent. Our objectives are that we will be able to use a limited amount of information about side lengths and angle measures to prove that triangles are congruent. We will be able to use coordinate methods such as distance and slope and algebraic methods to prove that triangles are congruent. So, our first two postulates. Our first postulate is the SSS postulate. If three sides of one triangle are congruent to three sides of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. So if AB is congruent to DE and BC is congruent to EF and AC is congruent to DF. Since each side here is congruent to a side here, those are congruent triangles. The reason it's SSS is because it's abbreviated for side, side, side. SAS, congruence postulate, says if two sides and the included angle, that's very important, this one, included angle of one triangle are congruent to two sides and the included angle of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. So what this would look like, if AB is congruent to DE and BC is congruent to EF, those are our two sides, the included angle would be the angle formed by these two sides. So in this case, B and E. So included, think in, inside, in between. It's in between the two sides. The angle is in between the two sides in the abbreviation. ASA is very similar, but this time it's two angles and the included side of one triangle are congruent to two angles and the included side of another triangle. So if angle B is congruent to angle E and angle C is congruent to angle F, then the sides we would be talking about are side BC and EF. AAS is two angles and the non-included side. So not in the middle of one triangle are congruent to two angles and the non-included side of another triangle. So let's say, again, angle B is congruent to angle E and angle C is congruent to angle F. It would have to be the side AC and DF. Angle, angle, side. Angle, angle, side. And our fifth and final congruence statement is the HL congruence theorem. This stands for hypotenuse and leg. Remember, hypotenuse is the side across from the right angle. So if these are our right angles, if the hypotenuse and leg of a right triangle are congruent to the hypotenuse and the leg of another right triangle, then the triangles are congruent. So AC and DF would be our hypotenuse. If those are congruent and either side, so it could be AB and DE, it also could be BC and EF. It doesn't matter which leg is chosen for it to fall under the hypotenuse leg congruence theorem. Which are the two combinations we didn't use? We did not use SSA. That one is not necessarily true. Or AAA. Triple A, we can have triangles that have the same angle measurements but have different side lengths, so they're not necessarily congruent by that. So we will never use SSA or AAA. So, determine which postulate or theorem proves the triangle's congruent, if any. So in our first triangle, we're given a side, then an angle, then another side. Again, a side, the angle's in the middle, and then another side. So these are congruent by side, angle, side. If we write our congruent statement, triangle, I'm going to start with T. I'm going to follow along the side that has one tick mark to the angle with one mark, which is K, and then follow along the side with two tick marks to letter V. This is very important because our letters need to be in the appropriate order when we write our second triangle. So I started from the side where there was no marks, so H, followed along the side with one tick mark to letter M, and then follow along the side with two tick marks to letter J. This one should be pretty easy to check. I'm given a right angle, so I'm probably going to be able to use hypotenuse leg if it works. The hypotenuse are marked congruent, and the legs are marked congruent. So I know that a triangle CUB is congruent. And I started with C, which was the angle in between the hypotenuse and the leg that was marked. So that would be the angle E here. Then I followed down the hypotenuse to U, so down the hypotenuse to W. And then our right angle was the final one, F. And finally, our first triangle, we're given a side, then an angle, then a side. Here, we're given a side, then a side, then an angle. Here, the angle was in between. That would work. Here, the angle is not in between, and we know that doesn't work. So this one is not congruent. So let's look at, if we're given some information, what other information would we need to know to use a certain congruence theorem? Whenever you see the word given, you should make sure that you're marking your pictures in order to reflect your given information. So side FE is congruent to ON. FE is congruent to ON. Angle F is congruent to angle O. What other information would we need in order to use the angle side theorem? Well, if the side is going to come last, and this is the side we're given, here's our middle angle, the other angle that's congruent would have to be angle M and angle D. Let's try another one. Again, we're going to start by marking the given information. So DF is congruent to MO. Angle F is congruent to angle O. And this one wants us to use angle side angle. So we have a side and an angle, a side and an angle. We want the side to end up in the middle. So again, angle D would have to be congruent to angle M. So the whole reason we're going over these theorems is so that in the long run we can use them to prove that triangles are congruent. So here's our first proof. We have some information that we're given, and then our end goal is to prove that this is true. So I'm going to start by marking my picture for the given information. TP is congruent to WO. Angle P is congruent to angle W. And angle O is congruent to angle T. So my given statements are going to be the first statements I use in my proof. TP is congruent to WO. Angle P is congruent to angle W. And angle O is congruent to angle T. And the reason we can make all these statements is because they were given. We were told to assume that these things are true. Now, based on our picture, we have an angle, a side, and an angle. Angle, side, and angle. Now, based on the information we were given, P and W should match up in the congruent statement. That works. T and O should match up in the congruent statement. So, based on this, we know that triangle PRT is congruent to triangle WLO, and we know this because of the angle side angle congruence theorem. For your summary, write the 5 shortcuts or the abbreviations that we use that can prove triangles are congruent. Also, compare and contrast angle angle side and angle side angle. Finish your summaries and we'll see you in class.